Communists sometimes report an exaggerated account of their political advocacy in the dialogues that tend to come up within that advocacy, roughly like the following quotation or paraphrase. Ask a communist what they dislike about capitalism, and they might assert an inherently exploitative nature of purchased labor, or they might decry various unchecked, profit motivated atrocities. Ask a capitalist what they dislike about communism, and they may well simply describe yet more capitalist failures. The same would appear generally true of many attitudes with which Americans and Canadians currently suggest right-wing alternatives, conservative alternatives in the partisan parlance of our country, to typical classically liberal government policy drafts. The savvy advocates of the criticized liberal policy typically tend to seek a compromise between various ensembles of platform priorities distributed among other governing officials affiliated with distinct partisan camps, more extremist partisan camps than the camp of the, so to speak, enlightened centrist mediators. Hence, for a hypothetical example, we get legislative effects, sort of like a portion of federal tax income will reimburse provinces for pharmaceutical insurance. Those provinces sustain for public health service beneficiaries up to some amount per patient, so long as those provinces simultaneously reduce taxation of private medical practice income. Naturally, this sort of compromise almost never pleases anyone, and so the resulting complaints never feel particularly surprising. Other parties' laws are always terrible. Vote our party to save the country in the next election. In other news, Vancouver Canucks fans don't like Boston. More fully surprising, however, is when the complaints from multiple different flanks of the legislating centrists, or would-be centrists, match not only in attitude, but also even in justification. Back to the example, this might hypothetically look like a strangely unified chorus of communists and nominal libertarians insisting that medical care is too hard to get right now, and this new law won't help because it ignores surgical services. Why might political factions with unmistakably divergent legislative agendas all play up the same challenging political goal? For example, surgical service access, mitigating the societal dangers of recreational drugs, keeping people safe from harsh weather. And also, why might more moderate legislators trying to mediate between them end up looking so out of the loop as to miss these ostensible points of common ground among the diverse partisan interests of their colleagues? Put simply, are the centrist liberals stupid? Well, I mean, maybe. The deep wisdom, the cached wisdom, would say, perhaps, that adversarial negotiation is maybe working okay if everyone ends up a little bit unhappy by the end. Of course, I can sour just about everyone's mood on a Vancouver transit bus by pooping in the doorway, but that doesn't mean that pooping in the doorway is a good idea, is a good thing for me to do on the bus. So maybe the centrists sometimes poop on the metaphorical bus. It seems very strange, though, that the great diversity of specialized expertise to which politicians often have access would still leave room for these colossal blunders seemingly as frequently as the symptoms that we've just been describing seem to show up. But if the absurdity that we've just discussed doesn't originate with the centrists, whose other reasoning might be a more important contributing factor? If multiple partisan political factions are seeking different policy plans for the same stated purpose, it seems likely one or more of them has room for improvement in their policy plan. Surely, among the vast sea of possible societal options for generating certain future states of the world, only a rather narrow portion of those options are liable to yield any particular results of stated interest. So, who's making the error? Well, the basic thesis of deregulatory policy advocates is generally some form or other of quote unquote trickle down economics. Unfortunately for them, and to a distinct extent, me and my fellow Americans, since around the 1980s, this sort of economical management strategy has in general produced, for US Americans among others, ballooning housing costs, commensurate social stress from suffering due to people's poor housing security, chronic American health care inaccessibility, and little to no effective global diplomatic consensus on climate change mitigation, not to mention the devastation of 2008's global financial crisis. On this empirical basis, I reject any suggestion that further tinkering with this economic policy paradigm will finally bring the large-scale changes I demand to the several urgent circumstances just described. So when right-wingers respond to milquetoast centrist equivocations with, we need lower grocery bills and better ease of living, I find that while I may agree with them on a shared concern for, say, food security, I disagree so strongly with the proposed right-wing solutions as to believe they would actually make the stated problems worse. This doesn't mean anyone has to be lying necessarily. I think many folks, politicians or otherwise, genuinely believe that indirect policy influences on commercial incentives can actually maintain widespread accessibility of all material human necessities, food, fresh water, housing, etc. However, as material conditions continue throughout my entire lifetime to worsen for those whose access to material wealth depends upon them selling their labor, i.e., for the working class, I find it gradually harder to believe that the small c conservative rhetorical misdirection outlined above is simply an innocent result of honest error. In tandem, I find myself gradually more convinced that the true cause of such mistaken arguments is either irresponsible degrees of ignorance or maybe actually intentional lying. These are, in a meaningful sense, distinct states of mind, but when the stakes are as high as legislative negotiation on behalf of millions of people, they seem just about equally evil. There's still a likely preference underneath the obvious nonsense of standard conservative complaints about centrists, though. This is a preference according to which it doesn't matter whether neoliberal or even more weakly regulated commerce actually allows, for example, adequate food security for everyone, because legislated socialist guarantees to satisfy material needs are inherently immoral, even tyrannical. There are myriad argumentative weeds available about what laws are or are not likely to actually protect, again, for example, universal food security. None of those weeds are worth entering, though, until there is in the first place a genuine in our bones consensus that we actually want governments to pursue such security with their power. If such a consensus actually existed, I suspect dialogue about relevant policy comparisons would look very different than it does currently, because the frankly obvious idea of using the money that represents public wealth to feed the public directly would be a mainstream benchmark for comparison rather than being at all distanced from the halls of power, as it is currently in Canada. Indeed, this is essentially the same strategy by which representative governments ever get anything done. Deterring public harm by foreign national aggression? use public wealth to protect the public. Maintaining safe travel routes, use public wealth for public roads. Investigating public safety risks, use public wealth for public courts. There are important devilish details that make all of these very difficult in practice, but if we accept the social priorities such government operations represent within a modern representative/democratic context, this generally effective strategy for responding to such priorities reveals itself as not just acceptable, but as bog standard. The roughly libertarian objections, however, are sure to continue, at least for the time being. As a result, if we're going to build stronger policy consensus, we need stronger philosophical consensus. What is representative government for exactly? In other words, why should or shouldn't communities on any scale consent to the activities of any such institution? As outlined with the examples above, I insist that justly representative governance is for anything the persons within its jurisdiction wish from it. Now, I'm sneaking a bunch of caveats into this hot take with that deadlifting beast of a word, justly, so as to restrain myself as much as I can manage from leaving a weaselly escape hatch in case of any weaselly hypothetical counterexamples. Let me try to elaborate a fuller description of the specific caveats I'm trying to use that word justly to entail here. An institutional of social governance is justly representative if and only if it satisfies the following 5 criteria. Criterion number 1, the institution of social governance protects, both in principle and in practice, the following ethical rights for all persons interacting with the institution, balancing conflicting rights against each other in a reasonable and self-consistent manner. These rights are going to be personal security, privacy, freedom of belief, expression, movement, and of personal association. Condition 2. The institution of social governance mediates fairly at all scales of interaction between the various needs and interests of differing social factions of any kind whose individual members are represented by the governing institution. Criterion 3, this institution of social governance is justly representative if its representation of a person's interests is reasonably accessible to that person if and only if they are substantially invested in the governed plurality of persons via prosocial personal relationships. But such representation of a person's interests is never withheld from a person once it has been reasonably offered to them. Criterion 3, an institution of social governance is just if and only if each person whose interests are explicitly represented within its dialogue receives such representation of their interests to an extent very close to equal the extent of the same representation the governing institution affords to each other person whose interests are explicitly represented within it. Finally, criterion 5, an institutional of social governance is justly representative so long as the methods and institutions of social organization that are established and or monitored by the governing institution are generally maintained in a manner that reasonably approximates the aggregated explicit preferences of all those persons whose interests are explicitly represented within the governing institution's dialogue. So, this effort of spelling the justification for government out quite explicitly still leaves a lot of ambiguity, both because of my appeals to intuition via words like reasonable and fairly, and also in that some tolerance must be afforded for the observation that no society yet devised could be genuinely counted on to perfectly satisfy the above conditions for justice, even for a single day. With that said, this seems to get us at least a little further than we were before by almost explicitly carving out old Mr. Jefferson's famous wolves and sheep thought experiment. A vote on eating any represented person infringes on personal security rights. So even a majority wolf voting bloc does not have complete ethical impunity. Sorry. We can, moreover, perform reasonably informative qualitative comparisons between differently governed societies in terms of their relative degrees of consistency with these criteria. So that seems useful. Basically, though, as long as it doesn't involve the government eating people or knowingly giving them syphilis or enslaving them or storing harmful substances near their residences or impeding their access to food and water, etc., we, the people whose interests the government is supposed to represent in its operation, should request whatever we collectively want. Taco Tuesday, National Mariachi Competition, Strategic Duck Reserve, Kindergarten Boomerang Training, Fish Tank Export Tax, you name it. A social consensus around it justifies a governing responsibility to legislate it. Having mostly clarified the contents of this claim, let's now return to the aforementioned libertarian objections. Governments, or at least individuals to whom they delegate authority, often wield the collective powers of the societies they represent for unjustly harmful purposes. Perhaps this problem can be avoided in its entirety if such institutions simply didn't exist. No institutional evil, just reasonable individuals solely and entirely responsible for their own decisions. Even given such a dramatic societal change, however, people will almost certainly continue to experience disagreements and conflicts of interest. So a central question that political and particularly democratic institutions seek to answer, therefore immediately presents itself. How should individuals, which is to say we the people, respond to such conflicts when they inevitably arise? Some anarcho-capitalists, libertarians as it were, tout a non-aggression principle, capital NAP, in an effort to answer this question without recourse to institutionalized delegation of personal authority or agency. If this NAP is to function for the stated purpose of mitigating conflicts, it requires a widespread understanding of aggression, which is to say an understanding of what that word means, that prevents conflicts from ever arising in the first place. In the absence of any universally credible arbitrator on that question, though, even slight disagreements about what behavioral constraints this NAP entails in practice are bound to produce material conflicts of interest sooner or later. Once those conflicts arise, the NAP provides no actual mechanism for reliably and ethically resolving them. Because of the extreme universality it would therefore require for the stated purpose, I don't think the widespread consensus on the meaning of a word like aggression in the non-aggression principle that would be necessary to make the NAP idea work on its own either exists currently or can be reasonably expected to exist for any plurality of persons anywhere at any point now or in the future. In some sense, every conflict can be understood as a conflict over exactly the question of what a principle or ideal like the NAP means in practice. Somewhere between breathing terrestrial atmosphere that others might also wish to breathe and killing anyone who attempts to locate themselves within 10 kilometers of the place where I habitually sleep, my behavior goes from being justified self-preservation to aggression. And if we're going to get along with each other as individuals, we need to reasonably negotiate between a variety of distinct initial understandings of exactly where the separation between those two ethical categories exists. In this way, libertarian theory of conflict resolution amounts to requesting that everyone simply agree not to have conflicts. This is obviously ineffective at best, and at worst, it's a self-serving effort to justify obscene hoarding of plundered wealth within whatever the present status quo happens to be. So what other mechanisms of conflict resolution are available? Essentially, addressing this problem in good faith seems in general to warrant representative centralized government operating on the basis of collectively delegated authority. The concept of representative in government in practice refers to the whole collection of strategies groups of people have thus far developed in all kinds of contexts for the purposes of effective coordination slash conflict negotiation. The priorities for just government listed above, or just now, are necessary precisely because those priorities are the conditions that any conflict mediation strategy must satisfy in order to be sustainable on a broad scale. Take away any one of them, and the result is not conflict mediation, but rather escalation. For example, deferring by default to the preferences of left-handed people involved in any real estate boundary disputes simply amounts to a coordinated effort at authoritarian oppression on behalf of left-handed interests. This is only conflict mediation in the sense that the Second World War was conflict mediation. It is not a pleasant or ethically desirable process. So the resulting project of finding more appealing and ethical alternatives is the referent of phrases like representative government. Going through the previous list of conditions for a justly representative government structures with this new perspective, that list of conditions might be formulated alternatively as follows. The negotiation process in mediating conflict has to be agreed upon voluntarily, probably ahead of time as some kind of social contract, as it were. It has to be fair. Its scope has to be limited to the context relevant for each particular negotiation, and its results have to reflect the preferences of all participants. At the very least, it has to reflect the preferences related to any particular relevant topic on which the participants are unanimous going into the negotiation. So, in order to maintain a reliable and safe mechanism for disagreement resolution, there must be a prior agreement of sufficient strength to generally keep everybody safe and preserve widespread personal agency in the process of that negotiation. Of course, however, the material universe can be rather scary, unhealthy, or threatening on a heavily unpredictable basis for individuals and for groups of people. This complicates the task of protecting the safety of conflict participants, trying to mediate their disagreements. So there's a third, but also equivalent way of understanding representative governance as a social and ethical priority. Government is that process by which people preserve each other's prerequisites for agency in social negotiations. Progressive anarchists might use the phrase mutual aid to evoke a concept that's at least similar. If we can step away, at least momentarily, from the rhetorical baggage of anarchist-specific language, though, the conceptual content here is pretty self-evident, or is at least hopefully self-evident. A reliable and reusable dispute negotiation mechanism requires that all potential participants be able to involve themselves to the fullest of their ability. The participants simply cannot do so if, for example, their societal conditions require them to communicate in ways they otherwise would not wish to, or if their personal safety is threatened by just about anything. As a result, the purposes of representative government reveal themselves precisely in terms of mutual aid, at the very least, in terms of that aid which is necessary to keep everyone healthy enough to participate fully in the ongoing negotiations required by coordination on the large scale of modern industrialized society. Some may say they don't want to participate in maintaining such pro-social conditions. They may object to the unfairness of the personal costs such necessary maintenance incurs. These people want, in some sense, to have their cake and eat it too, but this is impossible. Either we figure out how to share amongst ourselves the costs of systemic societal coordination, or else it is really just a war of all against all, and we're predestined for universal destitution. Readers who find that unfair, listeners who find that unfair, are encouraged to take it up with God if they ever get the opportunity. Having understood, as voters, the fundamental priorities of representative governance, we can finally return to the task of evaluating partisan regulatory negotiations in the USA and Canada and other national states with similar political context. With a rubric for just governance in hand, we can ask a question whose simplicity is compensated by its usefulness. Which policy platforms seek to materially enfranchise the electorate? In other words, who is doing for people, not institutions like businesses, nonprofits, churches, etc., the things functional governments should do for those people? Again, things like representing public interest, mediating disagreements, and coordinating the mutual aid that makes those objectives feasible. In this paradigm, policy items like commercial tax rebate incentives immediately present themselves as very dangerous, or at least suspicious. That's because they are, in effect, concessions to private unelected institutional powers, passing publicly maintained commercial infrastructure usage burdens onto other taxpayers, largely actual living and breathing people who will end up worse off. The former powers, which is to say the private commercial interests, then get to opt out of what would otherwise be a generally applicable and well justifiably perceived as generally applicable social contract, which erodes trust in other coordination efforts and makes those affected, those contracts affected, that much more difficult to maintain. I'm not going to assert that this could never produce a net material benefit for the general electorate through second or third order economic effects, say, but as a heuristic, I feel justified in being damn suspicious about the whole concept and the motivations for it in general. Moreover, if a community is so dependent on a particular commercial activity that incentivizing such activity with something like tax rebates seems important, but the activity can't be done profitably by private businesses subject to otherwise typical tax obligations, it seems likely there are options available other than just conceding all the wealth the activity generates to those same private interests in exchange for mere pennies on the dollar. Moving on as a final example, perhaps the main motivating example, to a more concrete refrain common to the Canadian political landscape at least, let's consider consumer gasoline pricing. Greenhouse gas emissions can be taxed with carbon pricing programs that generally will increase the consumer prices of such products. This cost ends up being footed by people who like to drive cars, and to a greater extent, transportation service businesses as a whole. As the libertarians like to say, though, there is no such thing as a free lunch. In the end, the data show clearly that GHG emissions will be costly one way or the other. We can, of course, collectively choose not to account for these costs in our commercial agreements, for example, by not governmentally enforcing carbon pricing. But if we don't, the resulting incentives will produce exactly what they have been producing via the same regulatory conditions all the way since the start of the Industrial Revolution. These results are added commercial profits for those holding contractual stakes in fossil fuel manufacturing businesses, at the cost of degradation to healthy atmospheric and climate conditions globally for everybody. Climate change is, in this way, a global coordination problem a la Prisoner's Dilemma, with many more than just two prisoners. So far, though, our going policy incentive structures have collectively been producing pretty miserable scores for our outcomes in this metaphorical dilemma. In the capitalist paradigm, either gasoline is a low-price commodity with subsequent GHG costs borne by society, or else it is a high-priced commodity whose consumers and merchants are compelled by law to compensate everyone else in at least some fashion for the resulting collective harms. As it happens, this is also the general problem that public municipal waste management projects seek to solve. The only reason carbon pricing is at all controversial is that it takes a lot of statistical insight and technical expertise to clearly see the metaphorical trash bags piling up in the town square. Maybe some misguided, in my opinion, listeners don't believe the pessimistic accounts of climatologists. Regardless of how accurate those climatological accounts are, though, it is an eminently clear fact that their scientific community is raising an ever louder complaint about the aforementioned collective costs GHG emissions allegedly impose. This is an eminently consequential conflict, at least between the recommendations of the climatologists and how human society is generally operating these days. As such, it is a conflict we should negotiate via the processes of civil governance that should ideally serve exactly the purpose of such negotiation. It will not do to, so to speak, let the free market decide or to just vote with our dollars. Social governance in all its forms is one of the most important tools for negotiating consequential conflicts, and abdicating our collective responsibility for maintaining the effectiveness of any part of that tool amounts to irresponsible concession to, so to speak, nature red in tooth and claw. Either we have a society and we should use it for a purpose, or we don't, and it's simply kill or be killed. I mean, you can call me a fragile weakling, but I know without a doubt which of these options I prefer. In recognizing our collective dependence on governance for conflict negotiation, a more productive response to complaints about GHG emissions may become more apparent, rather than the tyrants in national capital just want to steal my hard-earned tax money. We can recognize the shared problem before us. Refined fossil fuels are very powerful, but they also impose collective harms and costs for only personal and local benefits, generally speaking. How do we maximize the wealth we can maintain for each other from this technology, while minimizing those relevant harms? Or at the very least, while minimizing the undeniable worry about those harms that many folks, myself included, share and express. Remember, governments work for you does not mean that they are rhetorical cage fights wherein to find a strong faction to help bully other factions who might otherwise do stuff one doesn't personally like. They are therefore not justified by any mere mandate, as it were, whether divine or electoral or whatever, to price fix consumer gasoline, say, or to keep the soybean imports flowing. Governments work for you means that they are conceptual social tools for solving very challenging coordination problems, the sorts of problems that only get solved when thousands or millions or maybe even billions of individual agents are voluntarily cooperating to address them. It means that governments are supposed to help us track each other's grievances and negotiate effective responses to those grievances in collaboration with as many relevant folks as is feasible. No attempt to exercise social powers out of these broad and essential purposes is anything more than selfish grandstanding or should be treated as anything else. We must therefore negotiate at all scales of social interaction with empathy, grace, and conviction, lest we ever become unable to negotiate at all.